Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your co-host Caleb, and we're back again to talk about our experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journey spanning the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics throughout the lens of someone who grew up during that era. Today, we finish up our music series, our little music mini-series that we've been doing. Episode 6, it's the part 2 of our conversation with Eric and Josh about Christian music kind of in the 90s and their experience with it. And then really today, we're going to transition and talk a lot about what it looks like today and kind of how that Christian music scene has changed and kind of where it's at today. You get some great recommendations from both of them of just bands that they love or that they enjoy. They're still out there doing their thing. So we hope you enjoy part 2 of this conversation, and thanks so much for listening.
Let's transition a little bit into like where things are at now. One of the things that we talked about with another guest really recently, who was a worship pastor, is just kind of the difference between non-worship Christian music and worship Christian music, because it feels a little bit like worship is dominating that space at the moment, and we're all busy adults. I've never taken that time to figure out what's out there being made by Christians. Are there Christian labels anymore? Like, what's the overall status of the Christian music industry today?
I'll go first because Josh is probably more on top of what's going on now than I am. For me, like, I'll find independent artists, random places, Bandcamp or stuff, Tooth and Nail or Face Down Records releases. Like, My Epic they were put out by Face Down and now on Tooth and Nail. So found them, really, really liked them. And then there's people like Benjamin Daniel, who I just knew of from us being in the My Epic Facebook group together. Found his stuff, and he's now one of my very favorite artists doing it now. So my kids listen to modern Christian radio sometimes, and I don't find a whole lot that's really like scratches the itch of things that I'm looking for. But there is stuff out there that does. You just gotta dig around in all the nooks and crannies and hope you find something.
Mm-hmm. Not too dissimilar to what we had to do 25, 30 years ago, right? But sure. Just a little different format. Josh, what do you think?
I have largely given up on any radio, period. So Christian radio, mainstream radio, not bothered with that. DCM Twitter's been good for some things, but even still, as I write for JesusFreakHideout.com, as I write for reviews for them, we get independent submissions that'll come in. And so we'll just get some that are just real diamonds in the rough that really they just needed somebody to hear their music. With just the wide range of options that there are in the streaming era, where you could listen to what's already been for years and years out, and then what is coming out, getting people's attention is really, really hard. So like the word of mouth, I'm in several Facebook groups, and I've got the music threads on Facebook where we make recommendations to each other. Okay. And so that's how I'm finding stuff. And I'm always on the lookout for something that's fresh or something that's different or a different spin. There's nothing wrong with radio per se. It just isn't. It's just not for me. Like it's lacking in variety and nuance that I'm looking for. It's lacking in some of the introspective or lyrical depth that I'm looking for. So I typically don't listen to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that we don't have, or maybe it's even far harder to find than when we didn't have the internet. But in my experience, like it's just harder to find some of that stuff and find that expanse of options that we talked about before. And maybe I'm just not looking hard enough. But that worship space came in and just kind of took over. And our local Christian radio station I don't listen to either, because that's what most of it is, and that's fine. That's not. It doesn't resonate with me. It's not my thing. But I just wonder if there, maybe the downfall of the Christian bookstore, the downfall of a Christian record label per se, something that was putting out albums specifically that were Christians, quote unquote. That's gone now. So are there just Christian bands just making music, and how do we find them? Like I'm pretty curious about that.
Yeah. There's definitely some great ones out there. Like labels just aren't as willing to take a risk on anybody to actually develop them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember, like the perfect example that I can think of is Audio Adrenaline, right? Their first album was something. It had some songs on it that were listenable and some that were just like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then the jumping quality from that when it came out in '92 to Don't Censor Me, which I think was '93 or '94, was huge. And that's where Big House came from. And then I think they took an even bigger leap on Bloom in '96. So
Mm-hmm.
that was a label that was willing to take a chance on them and stick with them. Now, most labels are looking for an artist to already have a huge social media following before they'll even sign them
Mm-hmm.
because they want them to be a sure thing. They don't want to spend the money or they don't have the budget for it. So a lot of these independent artists are foregoing even signing with a label and just trying to go on their own. And so I think that's where I enjoy being able to come alongside and be a big fan and just kind of wave the flag for some of these artists that I think are great, but just don't have a whole lot of backing to be heard. And so I'll always throw out my recommendations every year on Twitter, and then I'll, for my own personal blog, say, hey, this is really something. If you like this style of music, this is going to be something that you'll love.
Mm-hmm.
Any genre that there is, it's out there. And you just do have to dig a little bit for it. But there are those that are out there that are digging for it. And people that I trust their recommendations to get them to me. And so yeah, I think it's there. It's just not. It's the delivery system is different with streaming.
Way different.
I'll also add Josh's blog is a great place to find, whatever, Christian stuff you're looking for. And the Jesus Freak Hideout, their year-end staff list that they put together is always one thing that I go to see, okay, what Christian music was out this year that, people that I trust, Josh, Scott Freiberger, Chase Tremaine, that their group, voted on. And that's honestly one of the best places to find new Christian music. I think go look at their year-end lists from the last few years. Check those things out because there's a wide variety on there and people who know what they're talking about.
That's great. Excellent recommendation. I didn't even know about that. So There you go. People can go.
Indie Vision Music is another guy that he might be doing less. And he's been going through some stuff, and I hope he's okay. But his family's getting the help they need and support they need. But he's got some great year-end lists, and I think he's got some staff folks with him, or he has come and gone. But he's another good resource. He's got a definite bent, but he's got that where I think with Jesus Freak Hideout you get a little more variety because the staff has got a little more variety. That's my take, and I could be way off, but so I like that you get the nice variety on their year-end lists.
Indie Vision Music was big for me in like the early to mid 2000s. I think they were good on, turned me on to a lot of bands, and they had forums back then, so you could talk about things like them. So yeah, they've done a lot of good work over the years too.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's excellent. When we listen to that music today, do we still feel as connected? Do we still feel as fulfilled? I just drove back from Iowa on a couple of days ago, and I was like, I'm going to listen to podcasts. And I didn't do that because we had this music conversation with a friend, and I just listened to like my 90s Christian albums, and most of them just really hit home. But there was a couple that I was going through, and I was like, no, I'm just going to skip this one. It wasn't as great as I thought it was, or I remember it to be, which is fine. It happens with all music. But like, do we still feel as connected with it these days, and why? Or why not?
Back when I was really like during the heyday of this stuff, I was just taking in anything I could find. I thought all of it was good. If it was contemporary Christian, it was good to me. I had been listening to, banjo foot stomping, and hymns my whole life. It all sounded good to me.
Mm-hmm.
As far as today, some of it definitely did not hold up as well. But the ones that did, I actually find more fulfillment in than even I did then. I think like Jars of Clay's Much Afraid is one for me. It's just a great album, I think. And me knowing more about music now than I did when it came out, I find even more in those albums. Michael W. Smith's Live the Life album, the production on that is so clean and atmospheric and just a beautiful sounding album. So yeah, I find more enjoyment with the ones that have stood the test of time.
Cool. Excellent. Josh, what about you?
Yeah, I think because I've got this playlist with over 500 songs from the 90s Christian music on it, and I'm regularly coming back to it in addition to a running playlist that I have for each year that I'm in. So I've got one for 2024. So I kind of alternate, kind of going back and forth between old and new. And because I'm writing reviews, I probably lean a little bit more on the new stuff now than the old, but I go back. And for the most part, there's not really anything that I would say that I wouldn't listen to at all because it just didn't age well. But there are some albums that I'm like, yeah, that wasn't as good as I thought it was then,
Mm-hmm.
looking back on it objectively now. And I think some of that for me too is because I've spent so much time going towards the alternative and heavier music side of things as I look back. And I'm trying to look with a critical eye with as much objectivity as I can when I'm making lists to add albums that I wouldn't have listened to then to that list and make sure that it's not just albums that I really enjoyed then that I'm putting like in my top 10, if that makes sense. So,
Mhm.
for example, I would have been listening to DC Talk a lot then. I would have been all about Supernatural. I still think it's a decent album, but there's a lot of issues I have with it now that I wouldn't have had then.
Mm.
I wouldn't probably include it in a top 100 of the 90s for me because albums like the 77's Sticks and Stones, which I didn't listen to back when it came out in 1990, I would place on that list very high.
Mm.
So there's just some that, yeah, for a nostalgic, just as a shout out to Church Jams now, a nostalgic bop, I'll go back and I'll listen to it and enjoy a few songs, but there's a few I'm going to skip and I'm going to be like, I'm probably not coming back to this for a while.
Sure.
And then there's some that I'm like, this holds up for me, like The Waiting, Bluebelly Sky, All Star United self-titled, Small Town Poet self-titled, Jars of Clay, Much Afraid, and their self-titled. Burlap to Cashmere. Is there anybody out there?
Yep.
Out of Eden's first album, Love in the Day. They're just, and then of course, some of the others like Poor Old Lose Sin and the 77 Sticks and Stones and The Prayer Chains Mercury. Some of these that, like I said, that I didn't get into at the time because I was listening to the other. I'm still going back and finding stuff that I love. So I'm still finding tons of albums from the 90s that I either never heard or hadn't heard in a really long time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, don't you think that speaks to the quality of that time? I don't want to be too cynical and say that's not happening now. It's just happening probably in a different capacity, right? And
Sure.
like we talked about, it's harder to find. But man, I agree with you. There are albums that I've gone back to just to, whether musically or lyrically, which I didn't fully maybe appreciate the depth of the lyrics back then. But in a non-worship setting, we're obviously not going to sing these songs in church. I want to listen to, definitely not Eric's church, and but I just want to listen to somebody's experience that way, and that means a lot.
You're not gonna listen to Mercury, the Prayer Train's Mercury at in the middle of Eric's old church. Yeah, that's probably
If they want to try and cover Sunstone, that's fine. I think I would enjoy that, but it's not made for that setting, right? But
we wouldn't even gone there at our church. I think even our youth pastor was a little weirded out by, and he was pretty into all this stuff. Even he was a little weirded out by the beginning of Shawl when that yeah. I'm sure he was just like, what are you guys listening to? Give me Petra.
But there was room for some of that, right?
Yeah.
We were lucky to be in it back then. Any other comments about that? Any other comments about just like artists you either listen to now that still hit, or you're just not going to listen to at all? Like I'm just kind of done. I'll be honest. I put in Caleb. You put up a phono, that album Phono, and I was like, my brain was like, I really like that album, and that was one I tried to listen to in the car on the way home. I'm like, I don't know.
Oh boy, there's gonna be fighting words here.
I still like that one.
Sorry,
I still like that one.
I do too. I mean, but again, I wasn't aware of Oasis back then. Like now that I know Oasis, I'd be like, okay, so that's where some of these influences are coming from.
Sure.
Sure. I still like several of the songs on that one.
I just think it's amazing, like that sound clip when Josh just starts going through those, throwing out Burlap to Cashmere, and like that is why I can still get into so much of this. I think it's because of why it still hits the same to me is that there's so much variety, not even in style, but in lyrical content in stuff that's talked about that I can put on something from that time frame. And I'm going to even throw early 2000s in there because I think there's still some really, really good quality stuff coming out into the mid 2000s and even 2010, even though I fall off a lot after 2004, just personally. But like, if I want to listen to something fun, I can throw on, I listen to, my personal life here, I battle pretty good bouts of insomnia where I just don't sleep for nights on end. It's a real fun existence I have. But I was up doing something, and I was like, I need something to lighten the mood here at 3 a.m. as I'm just trying to not feel desperate. So I put on Free at Last, and I listened to it while I was doing some other stuff, some really boring, monotonous work, and it was perfect. And it's like, I can put on that for fun. I can put on something by the Prayer Chain for that kind of, if I'm feeling just a little more restless and I want some of that darkness that's, sometimes is good for you to get your angst out. I can put on the ska stuff that's obviously going to be a lot more fun. There's just so much variety, that you can throw on the cheekiness of The Waiting, where I feel like that first album is it's very fun and very serious, and they're bouncing back and forth. There's so much variety, not even in music, but in just stuff that was talked about, topics, the way people approached things. You got to see into people's lives. That I think that is also what makes a lot of it still to this day probably the most endearing music for me, even though there's other things that I really, really, really love. So I think that is another, what speaks to that time a little bit.
Agreed.
I think Josh and I agreed on 95 through 2004 being like the golden age of Christian music. Something I've been thinking about lately is I feel like Christian rap is really thriving right now.
Oh.
In the same way that rap in the secular culture is thriving and rock is hurting. So I start thinking maybe it's not so much that it's just that the Christian industry has moved on from finding artists, kids who grow up now more want to be rappers than they do want to learn guitar. And like, if you follow Rapzilla, there are hundreds of Christian rappers that I have never even heard of that site is posting about. It's just, it just seems like it's really thriving right now. So I think part of it is not only worship music taking over for church music, but just that the culture in general is not as focused on rock music.
I wish they would be. I miss good old rock and roll music.
Me too.
Same.
I don't wonder if rap being so popular and even worship to some degree for Christian music isn't due to the fact that you can make a lot of it on your laptop in your room and not have to be in a studio. You wouldn't have been able to do that, 30 years ago. But now you can make beats and you could have a rap album in a matter of months versus years and lots of money that it would cost to do it. And of course, I know that CCM is leaning heavily towards the worship area because I think CCLI changed a lot of things for a lot of people. Once they figured out they could get on the CCLI list and they could make money, good money, writing worship songs, that's where a lot of the artists went. Even what you were saying, I think it was you, Caleb, that was saying it. Just there's less sharing of the artist themselves and the work that they're making, and it's less personable. So to me, it's less. I relate to it less relatable.
Yeah.
Not that I can't worship God to a worship song, but I'm looking for nuance and something else. Or
to steal from our friend Tim, I'm looking for a little subtext and not so much text. Make me think about it, please.
Yeah. Josh, I don't know about you, but I sometimes wonder about if Squint Records had not gone under like so quick, because they had Burlap to Cashmere, they had Chevelle, they had Sixpence None the Richer,
LA Symphony too.
LA Symphony.
Nice.
They had like really good bands coming into the 2000s, and then I think the label like got bought out or
they just ran out of money. It's what happened to so many Christian labels. They wanted to be these boutique labels and have those were killer bands to have on a label. And they wanted to be split in both worlds. They want to be able to get into mainstream, but also still impact the Christian realm. And most labels would find there wasn't enough money to advertise to both. And so they one band might be able to get them through, and it probably was sixpence for a while based
Mhm.
off of the success of Kiss Me. But
Yep.
yeah, yeah, Taylor I think just ran out of money. I think I heard him talking about it on a podcast at one point, and then he just couldn't keep it going, which it is a shame because that was a killer roster and pretty
Yep.
diverse
Yeah.
for only
Mhm.
being 4 or 5 artists.
Yep.
And you think about a guy who's built to lead it. I think he would have been. I mean, that's what he does now. He runs an art school, and like, I can't think of a better person to be shaping people of faith and their artistic endeavors than him. I think
Yeah.
he's about perfect for it. So yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
If they can just last a little longer and maybe even occasionally tap into some of that. I mean, this is so cynical. Tap into some of that worship money and then funnel it to non-worship places. Like, what could have he done? That's a really
Mm-hmm.
that's an alternate universe I'd like to visit real quick.
For sure. For
Well,
sure.
and this may not be where you want to take this, but maybe this is a joining of the two worlds. What I would really love to see, rather than because there's some labels now that are more of like a collective, right?
Hmm.
So artists are really independent for all intents and purposes, but they're under a label umbrella to be able to tour with other artists, but they're not having to do some of the things that the label would do for them or be locked into a contract or anything like that. I would love to see churches in some way become what it used to be for when Christians were making statues and painting the Sistine Chapel. The church paid for them
Hmm.
to make these great works of art that have been appreciated by not just Christians but anybody.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see churches adopt and think of musicians as music missionaries that can make music for the church, but also just making music in general to be salt and light in the world, just making something excellent of great quality, worth being listened to. Churches adopting them and sending them out as music missionaries, and Patreon, like helping fund what they're trying to do so they don't have to be signed to a label or they don't have to
Mm.
work so hard at touring that they can't sustain doing what they're doing.
Hmm.
I really just think that would be and it's a model that makes sense to me, to be able to think about it in a different way. Like obviously we pay some of our worship leaders to lead us in worship on Sundays, but a lot of times that's one day a week. This is an opportunity for us to step outside the walls of the church and make an impact on preserving culture through the salt and shining light in the dark places. And we miss that opportunity because some bands just don't have the money to be able to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
Well, and as you mentioned, they did that with other forms of art, and music is an absolute legitimate form of art. And part of the reason I kind of miss some of this stuff from back in the day is that, you had Christians who were artists making really good music, right? And so use that as art will always be able to communicate God in a different way than just preaching will.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a great comment, great idea. Like, it's a very valid way to bring the gospel to different places.
Yeah.
I'm a little curious, especially with both of your, experience just following some more bands a little bit longer than I have. But in what ways did Christian music influence the secular music industry? We talked a little bit about some of these bands, like you said, that just kind of went to crossover. Switchfoot is another one to me. POD a little bit more quickly in that way. But yeah, we talked about on a previous episode one genre coming out of a Tooth and Nail label. I can't remember what genre you're talking about, but like, was it?
So sorry, I'll jump in. So yeah, metalcore in the mid 2000s is something that I think. I mean, this is why I'm glad the actual historians are here. I think it grows out of Tooth and Nail, and then becomes this force in secular music that is still around and relevant today. So I think that is something that is unique for, especially for a lot of us who left. I mean, 2004 is when my official departure from Christian music. That's not totally true, but I think that's what happens in the mid 2000s. Does that feel accurate?
Yeah, I think more than any other genre of the like modern age, the metalcore has been the one that's kind of the Christian bands have at least had a strong influence on where the genre, the scene is going.
Mm-hmm.
Like Under Oath were one of the biggest bands in that scene.
Yeah.
As I Lay Dying, Mama Jean, these bands were huge in what was probably the underground scene of the time. So yeah, I would say that that is definitely the area where you could say Christian bands had the most like influence on culture. It wasn't strictly Christian bands who were leading that, but they were definitely on the forefronts and doing different and interesting things.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that Tooth and Nail still can do what they do? Because like we talk about, the record labels have all died, right? Squint, great record label. I think we're all mourning that loss.
R.I.P.
5 Minute Walk. I mourn the loss of 5 Minute Walk, although that died for different reasons. But is that one of the reasons that Tooth and Nail persists to this day and is making money? I mean, because I think they're still fairly successful. Is that one of the reasons that they still are around?
I would say that yeah, they're drawing a lot of stuff from streaming revenue and things like
Hmm.
that from these bands that were so big back then. I don't know like the details of their financials. I do know that they are not taking as many risks as they used to,
Hmm.
so they don't have that kind of unhindered creativity that they could to take on artists who were more experimental or didn't already have huge fan base.
Hmm.
But they're still. I mean, they're still signing good bands. Valley Heart, My Epic, but these are artists who have been touring for several years or who
Hmm.
were on another successful label. They're just not taking the chances that they used to, and that's I think making it hard for like breakout, artists to
Hmm.
come out of the underground like
Sure.
they used to.
Hmm. So it
Yeah.
kind of goes back to that comment Josh made about Audio Adrenaline and that the idea that, was it Forefront? Were they on Forefront? That whoever they were on,
Yeah.
whoever Audio Adrenaline
Mhm.
was on, took their time
Yeah.
with them. And like, there's, yeah, I can see that maybe Tooth and Nail's doing less of that. You get a band that's, they're kind of stealing from another record label. One of the fun, that this is totally, Audio Adrenaline is such an interesting one. I'm not a huge Audio Adrenaline guy, but their first number one record comes out in 1999. It's Underdog. Like it did. You totally nailed that with that idea of like a record company building into somebody. That's a 10-year build to
Mm.
get that number one record out of them. And yeah, I can imagine that for most of these, even the worship focused record labels today, I bet you they are not jumping in with somebody who's a little raw and they see the talent. They're waiting for, hey, look, this person's already produced a big hit of some sort, and we're gonna swoop in and pick them up and say, hey, come join us here. And
Yep.
and yeah.
Big House probably provided just tons of revenue, just replay after replay after replay.
The evergreen Big House.
My favorite thing about Audio Adrenaline is I make the joke all the time because it's in 2016, 17, I think, around that time, when the record label literally just threw out four guys who were never in Audio Adrenaline, called them Audio Adrenaline, and then put them on tour. And when you joke about that on CCM Twitter, which is something that the Josh, Eric, and I go back and forth a lot on, when you throw it out there, there's people who don't know that, and then they get really upset that you're like bagging on like late stage Audio Adrenaline. I'm like, no, I'm not. The original band is fine. I totally saw them in the 90s. It was a fun, it was a
Yep.
fun thing that was going on. This was a train wreck, and people are like all mad at me, and I'm like, go look at
This
Spotify,
is
look at the
Audio
picture.
3.0. That's 3.0, man.
It's a deep cut on the Christian music side of the Audio Adrenaline 3.0. I love it.
They were like, "Well, it worked for the Newsboys. Let's try it with Audio Adrenaline."
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a miracle we haven't had three random dudes that are DC Talk now.
Yeah. That is kind of amazing, actually.
I saw
Oh,
a
man.
funny one, and it might have been one of you guys recently that was like, was there ever a greater lie in Christian music? And it was just the DC
Eric.
Talks intermission album cover. Like, yeah, I remember that coming out and be like, they're coming back soon.
Yeah,
One of
Eric,
these
you're really good
days.
at those humorous memes. I've never
Oh,
got it. I
thanks.
can never do it. You post them all the time, and there's a couple of them that I've literally been laughing at work, and people are like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "I got to stop checking my phone during work."
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Josh, what about you? What do you think are some ways that Christian music has influenced secular music?
Oh gosh. Rap, probably some. Like Lecrae, even just with his partnerships or his relationships with even those like Kendrick Lamar. There's some influence there. I don't think a ton, but I think even Lecrae had some influence on Chance the Rapper. And
Hmm.
the other, I would say, and I totally agree with what Eric was saying about Under Oath and the metal scene. They absolutely The other one I have a question about, I'm not so much like definitively yes, but Starflyer 59 and Shoegaze. I don't think
Mm.
they created Shoegaze, if you will, but they certainly helped kind of propel it forward once they started and have kept it going throughout the years. But there's just kind of isolated events. Like you think about Amy Grant's 1991 Heart in Motion, that was a big pop album.
Yeah.
A hugely calculated and put together with amazing producers and songwriters, and that had an impact on mainstream, obviously. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there is a ton, to be honest with you, outside of a few isolated events like POD, of course, and Switchfoot in 2003. I know that's what they were. A lot of bands were probably or artists were aiming for, but most of them, I think, were pretty happy to be where they were in the 90s
Yeah,
anyway, because there was plenty of money being tossed their way for what they were doing.
Yeah.
that's true.
I think the rap one's a good one because NF is a rapper who started in that Christian space. He's definitely transitioned. I've had two coworkers who I don't believe have any. Well, I know for sure one of them has zero interest in faith. Uh, have mentioned NF in music conversations, and both times I've kind of gone and been like, one of them I was like, "Hey, just so you know, this is where he got his start," and so I think he's having an influence out there. I think that's
Sure.
a good call
Yeah.
out, and it's not, I
Mm-hmm.
think it's not just crossover. I think he is actually having some influence in how he approaches things. I think a lot of parents really are all for him, like
Sure.
because they're kind of like, oh, I'm hearing this on your video game, and it doesn't feel like anything's being censored out here. And I think everything that he's talking about is I'm okay with this. So he's having not only crossover success, but I do wonder how much is he having starting to have an influence on the culture of it too.
Yeah. Here's maybe the spin I'd put on the question. I don't know, like, if you're talking about now, are you talking about now or are you talking about then, like in the 90s?
Either.
Yeah, either one.
Okay. I would say, like, now, if the question were how are Christians making an impact on the mainstream music world, but I think there's a lot of Christians that are not what I would call Christian bands that are making an impact. Like,
Hmm.
talk about bands like 21 Pilots, Half Alive, NF is a good example. The Gray's kind of been back and forth, but you have some artists too that are forgoing labels and making a big impact on mainstream, like Jake. I don't know if you guys know him. He's a pop artist that writes all his own stuff. David Kushner. These are artists that gotten big on like TikTok first,
Hmm.
Mm.
and now they have albums and songs that everybody and my kids are introducing a lot of them to me, and I'll do a little research and I'll find out. Oh yeah, this guy's definitely a believer, but he's not looking to make Christian music. He's just looking to make music that anybody's going to want to listen to, and you can see that their faith is informing it, but it's not so explicitly Christian that it's going to turn anybody off. And I think
Mm.
there's certainly a place for that more so in this era of music. And I'm glad that there is because we need to have people that are doing that just as much as we need people that are encouraging the church through worship music and pop CCM and even an underground scene of indie artists that are very thoughtful, introspective, excellent lyricists, or writing even what I would call like devotional pop music, where it's kind of ripped from their own personal prayer journals and very relatable to how they're approaching life. Not necessarily something you'd sing on a Sunday morning in a worship service, but something that you could relate to on what they're going on in their life. So there's a very wide range of possibilities of things to listen to. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think there are certainly quite a few Christians out there that are making an impact, but it's much more covert than it would have been in the 90s.
Hmm.
For sure. That's cool to know. A couple more questions. You guys spent a lot of time with us tonight. We really appreciate this. What are some of your favorite artists, Christian artists, doing today that you want to highlight? You mentioned Steve Taylor, of course. Shout out Steve Taylor, my first Christian concert. Steve, if you're listening, come on the show, please. But
That'd be a good get for us.
then we'd be done. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have to talk to anyone else. But he's coming out with like a movie with Tony Hale and a couple other people. He's doing like a Russ Taff, new album, that sort of thing. And I think that it's super cool that guy has persisted. And, I know Aaron Sprinkle continues to produce a bunch of good music. Like, what are some artists doing right now that you really like that you want to highlight for us?
Falling Up, who were my favorite, well, they are my favorite band, but they were somewhat big in the mid 2000s. And then I think really hit their creative stride in the early 2010s, have reunited, coming out with an album where they are going to be changing their name to the Chilling Alpine Adventure, but it's going to be Falling Up presents the Chilling Alpine Adventure. So it's still a Falling Up album, but it's a transition, and that's supposed to be out by the end of the year, and I am so excited about that. Starflyer 59 still been putting out quality stuff. His newest album is kind of a return to like the shoegaze sound that he had a part in pioneering, and I think this album is getting him like more attention than he's seen in quite a while. So that's pretty exciting. I know Small Town Poets is still doing stuff. Always checking out whatever they put out. Hopefully Jars of Clay will get back together one of these days and put something else out there.
Can always hope.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed, but I just don't think I see it happening.
Yeah. I mean, so the reunion stuff is for some bands, it's pretty fun, but it's not for everyone. That's all right.
Yeah.
Josh, what about you?
My list is long, so I'll try to be quick with it. But John Van Dusen is probably the one that I would say across the board he's been my favorite artist of the last 6 or 7 years. Stumbled across him by a recommendation by a random person online, checked out his album, I think in 2017 is when it came out, wrote a review for it, and I've just loved everything he's done since then. He's got an album coming out November 1st. Cool plug for him. On Tooth and Nail, actually. Shingera, he has been around for a while, but doesn't have a ton of albums. He's got a couple. Keeper of Days is one of my favorites of the last 10 years. That would be what I would describe as a devotional pop album. Yulia Taylor, she also has a band called Liam of Earth, but she is just a beautiful singer, songwriter. Slow Parade is an album that came out this year that's really good by her. Eric's already mentioned Benjamin Daniel. I will say it again. I say it every podcast I'm on. He's one of the best lyricists out there right now that's writing lyrics. He's a very deep thinker, and I love the way that he puts words together and turns phrases and tells stories through his songs. My buddy Chase Tremaine is writing some fun emo pop music. Great guitarist. Chris Rinsma, the Grey Havens they're like a narrative pop. So Much Hope Buried is a band that I discovered this year. It's a little bit heavier than what I typically would listen to, but I really have enjoyed them. Their song Idle Hands is a favorite from this year. Dawson Hollow is one of those bands that's Christians in a band, not really a Christian band, but they have a very diverse album that's out this year. Gable Price and Friends, I enjoy them. Zane Vickery had an excellent album called Interloper that came out this year. Forrest Frank is kind of like a happy rap. He's one half of Surfaces, if you're familiar with him. Wrote the song Sunday Best. This is his solo stuff. Kind of fun, worshipy hip hop. Taylor Linhart is a singer-songwriter, kind of an Americana vein that I love. The Arcade Wild is like new bluegrass that I love from last year. And then No Big Deal is a rapper that I really enjoyed. So it's as quick as I can go, but those are some of the ones that I keep coming back to over the course of the last 5 to 7 years. And I think they're all, and I'm probably forgetting somebody important, but those are the ones I've been listening to a lot this year and in the last 5-6 years.
Well, I will say I know nobody on that list. I'm excited to listen back to this and just go through all of that.
And I would say if you want to hear that list, don't just listen to that part over and over again. Help our stream or help our listens by going back to the entire episode, listening over and over again, because there's so much in that list that Josh just went over that, listen to the whole episode again and then just be ready with your pencil. Don't just review that part.
Wow, what a shameless ask.
That's right. Go back
shameless.
Go back and timestamp the part where we heard something about a fish in somebody's pants, because that's still sticking out.
I will
say that
say
episode won't be out till after this, unfortunately.
After this? It's probably closer to Thanksgiving, but
yeah. I haven't even begun to edit that.
Yeah, that was a little preview. That was my cousin's episode. So once you hear it's my cousin, you'll know what we're going to talk about. That's not the craziest thing that he did in his youth group. We'll just say that. But anyway, no. On that note, again, you guys spend a lot of time with us tonight. I don't want to take up too much more of it. please tell us. I feel like I'm the guy on Hot Ones where he says, that camera, that camera, that camera. Tell us what you're doing these days. Obviously no cameras here, but that microphone, that microphone. Tell us, like, where can we find you online? You know, what stuff do you have online where people can go find and interact with you?
You can find me pretty much anywhere at Ineverglow, INEVERGLOW. I never glow, according to Caleb.
I mess it up every time. I'm a failure.
No, you're not the only one. It's okay. You can find me there on YouTube. I'm really focusing on YouTube right now. Got a show called The Ineverglow Show with Kylan Savage from Church Jams Now. Produces that show for me. AJ Simmons, who a lot of people know from Twitter, is on there most of the time with me. You can also find that on podcast, The Ineverglow Show. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing.
Awesome. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, Eric's a good follow on Twitter for sure. He's got some
thank you.
content
For sure.
and,
You guys are both must follows on Twitter. I think if you're gonna be into music and you have any sort of interest in Christian music, you guys are the two must follows on Christian music Twitter, in my opinion.
Thanks.
On that,
Thanks.
keep talking about yourself,
my
guys.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is at jbay, JBAY _ all the way. You know, you make a Twitter name years and years ago, and and then you have to read it 10 years later, and you're like, what was I even thinking? But there you go, Josh Baylog. Yeah, I also have my own blog. I think you mentioned it, joshbaylog.wordpress.com, because I'm too lazy to pay for the domain name. I blog about music. I sometimes will do devotional blogs, but it's mostly about music, and it's mostly about Christian music. Sometimes I'll do reviews. A lot of times I'll do nostalgic look backs on albums. I've got lists galore, if that's your thing, on all the decades. I've got lists on 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, all those decades, my favorite. And you can find me on the Jesus Freak Hideout occasionally, discussing things with Chase and Scott and Evan and others, and of course writing reviews for Jesus Freak Hideout occasionally as well. I will go on any podcast and talk about Christian music, especially 90s Christian music. So when you guys invited me, I was like, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think both of you guys' websites are great. You have some great lists. I go back to them all the time.
Cool.
Both of you guys have put out some really great lists, and I know, you know, Josh has got a couple lists that are like, you know, if you're interested in like this 90s and you want to go back and figure out what else was out there, you've got a list of at least one of like the top 100 Christian albums of the 90s. You know, there's lots of stuff out there. You know, Eric's list of like his favorite 250 albums list, which I know is getting reviewed and updated, but just both of their websites have just these great resources of, you know, just endless amounts. And I'm going to plug one other thing on Josh's website that I think is a really, really great read. I've pushed it a couple times with people. It's an article you wrote about the change, the impact 9/11 and the album by POD Satellite and the worship album by Michael W. Smith, and how that all kind of coincides together and the impact that had on the Christian music industry. I know a lot of it is like, I think you preface it with like, it's not like you've got a ton of facts to back it up. It's a little more anecdotal, but it's a great read. It's a really, really good, insightful look at the Christian music industry. So it's stuff like that you guys have both put out there that I think is also just really, really worth diving into. I push that story a lot because I think people will be like, what happened? And I'm like, this is a good place to start to get a vision for what happened to the Christian music industry. So,
just my guess anyway. Between that and focus groups and Becky, those are the things I would say change things.
Oh man. Well, hey guys, we really appreciate this very, very much. Thank you for spending time with us to talk about this, and hope to drive a lot more attention your way in the stuff that you're doing to talk about the subject. Because look, everyone's going to have nostalgia about the music of their youth, but there is something pretty special about what we got to grow up with, and it's really fun just talking about it, especially just in light of, you know, I've one that it's certainly just fallen by the wayside, just in terms of like, I'm not seeking it out anymore. You know, we're all busy adults or whatever. So to listen to some of these, I'd forgotten about Falling Up. You know, to listen to some of these bands, just like, yeah, I'm gonna go check them out again. That's really fun. So we encourage all of our listeners to try it out, try a few out to see, if it still resonates with you. So thanks very much for spending time with us here tonight.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Thanks, guys. All right, Caleb, we've made it to the end of our music series. We had planned for a few episodes. We got 6 episodes out of it because we had such good conversations with our guests. This is very much off the cuff. We did not prepare, so apologies if it's a little raw, but just kidding, we never prepare. So it's I'm just curious, like what do you think of the whole conversation between Bill, Tim, Eric, and Josh, spanning from our 90s experience talking about worship music and then talking about where Christian music is at today. Give me your thoughts. Whoa, you for the first time regarding Christian music are speechless.
Yeah.
This is great.
I think one of the thing that was so evident to me throughout this kind of doing these episodes is how meaningful this music was to us and to Bill and Tim, I believe, as well, and Josh and Eric. I think that's what's really stands out from it. And I know I've said it a couple times, but I think it's amazing to me how so many people who've left the faith still have this connection. And so it makes it like, why have these episodes gone long? Because I think everybody's having a great time talking about it. I think everybody is excited to engage about the topic. I really don't have a hard time getting guests to come on to my music podcast to talk about old Christian albums. I have a hard time getting guests to talk about things like REM. Like that's partially who I'm connected with online. Like I post about both Christian and non-Christian albums. But when I throw out, like, I get people like beating down the door like, hey, can we talk about this album? And I'm like, sorry, it's not on my schedule for whatever reason. Like even stuff that I have never been a huge Audio Adrenaline fan, but I bet you if I would throw out like an Audio Adrenaline album that's celebrating a big anniversary, I would get tens, not hundreds, tens of people. But I mean,
dozens.
The idea that dozens. I throw out the idea that, hey, you want to talk to me about Underdog? I bet you I would get 10 to 20 people will be like, I'd be on your podcast to talk about that album. That's really, really intriguing to me. And I think that really highlights why these conversations have been so engaging and why they have gone so long, because I think it's just people want to talk about it. And we even made the joke, there's an upcoming show with an upcoming guest that we're like, we got done with talking to him about his youth group experience and we're like, we didn't even get into music. And it was like this whole, like, then we all had like a 10-minute conversation, even though it was already way too late about music. And we're like, oh, we got to focus. We got to get this other episode recorded, because it was just, I think it just kind of comes out of us. So I think that's the thing that stands out the most from just the interactions of these last 6 episodes.
Yeah. And for most people, music is the soundtrack to their youth, and they really identify with it, and it will always be important to them. For us, I think there's a different kind of connection, just given that there's a spiritual aspect to it. And we really do see now, I think what's satisfying now is we can go back and look at some of these artists and their lyrics and what they're talking about and realize how spiritual they were without being blatant. Of course, we'll always love Five Iron for how well they did that, but they were so very much on the sleeve, wearing their emotions and what they're trying to say on their sleeve.
Yeah.
And it was great because they had a lot of really great things to say that we would never have been challenged with or discussed in a youth group setting. But others were, I think about the conversation about the Prayer Chains Mercury, right? Like, I love that album so much. And when I go back and listen to it, I'm like, dude, this is so good. And I did have a hard time understanding the spiritual value of the lyrics. But now that I'm a little older and slightly wiser, I can go back and understand, what they were trying to say.
Yeah.
And that's satisfying because that was always there. So it was connecting with me on a spiritual level when I was a teenager and I didn't know why.
Yeah. I think the other thing that is just worth highlighting, and it kind of came up on our first couple episodes with Bill, where we started talking about this idea of there was so much out there. 6 episodes, I guarantee you, there's bands that we missed that people are like screaming at
I know.
the
It's like,
podcast, like, how can you not talk about
talk about
Dakota
this
Motor
one.
Company? Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, they just weren't as big of a thing for us, but
Yep.
I'm glad you loved them. How can you not talk about this or that? And there's a guy who I interact with a little bit on Twitter, and he tends to really be in love with the pop music. That's more of his thing, and he's just always been. He's like he's down with the alternative stuff, but like the Christian pop music is really what he loves, and so like he's all in on like the R&B stuff. And we, again, just something that we barely Kirk Franklin got one little mention on the show. There's a whole industry of that, of R&B, that we just didn't get into because it wasn't really our thing. And I think that's what is also just kind of amazing, is I know we missed people. I know in his bands, there's bands that I love that we just didn't mention because you only had so much time, and we kind of start feeding off of each other a little. So I think that's the other really kind of amazing thing that is there, and that there's just so much out there. There was so much out there, less so now, but there's still some things out there.
Yeah, it's a really good reminder of like, hey, this stuff was meaningful for a reason. So no matter where you're at spiritually, whether you're done with the church or you're still fully engaged or anywhere in between, like that music will probably still bring back some of those warm fuzzies
Yeah.
for you, because it was such a meaningful experience and because the quality was actually pretty darn good.
Yeah. Yep.
There wasn't a race to the top or race to the bottom, however you want to look at it, of just trying to crank out records. There was a lot of indie to it, and we were the beneficiaries of that.
Yep. And what kind of gets lost here, partially just because of the order that we recorded these. So again, a little behind the curtain. We didn't record them 1 through 6. They were out of order.
Again, like Star Wars.
I know.
No, nope, don't do it.
I'm
Don't
just
do
trying to
it.
think how that works. Well, anyway, we talked to Tim first, so a little behind the curtain. That's kind of the middle part of this conversation. And so we've had these now 2 other conversations where we've gone, kind of on these love fests for 90s Christian music and some of the other Christian music. But I think what gets lost then is I kind of have forgotten about how engaging that conversation was about worship, and how it was so interesting to break that down with somebody who, I'll call him an expert. You lead worship for 10, 15 years. You get that label, whether you may like it or not. But like, that's somebody who was deep in the worship music and was, literally providing for his family by producing worship music, by getting that ready for a congregation. And so that's going to bring a lot of thoughts on that topic. And so that's the other thing that I, now that we're kind of past that, that I got finished editing that episode a month ago, it feels like. And, there is this kind of sense of like, yeah, that conversation is one that is now, I think I mentioned it on another show, is sticking with me at church. Some of the things he said, and I think his comment about text versus subtext has come up on a lot of our shows now, but that is sticking with me even at church. Like, I'll see lyrics up on the screen at church and we're singing this song and I'm just like, oh, here's some text. Yep, there it is. Yep, we're still talking. Yep, darkness bad, shadows bad, light good, rock strong. Great. And like it hits me now so heavily, this idea that like, man alive, we're just singing text, we're not singing subtext anymore. And I know that is a super cynical response to that discussion, but it was pretty insightful to kind of sit down with him and to be able to engage in that topic in a way with, again, somebody who's really had a lot of time to think through that topic.
I will say that Tim's episodes were some of my favorite, not only because Tim is one of my favorite people. Sorry, Caleb, you're not on that list, but Tim and I are close friends, but also to just being able to digest that topic in the way that we did was very, very helpful for me too. And, I have the same experience as you, where I don't want to get to a point where I'm super overly critical. I've gone through that, and maybe it served a purpose for a year or so, a couple of years, but it's exhausting as well. And I still try to get out of a worship setting, song, whatever I can, but I don't think there's any harm in trying to understand, think through the theology of what things are. What are we talking about?
Yeah.
What's the theological implication of some of these verses and these words? It's not bad to want better art out of an artist. And I think that in particular, it's helpful for me at least just to understand that there's a difference between mass production stuff and stuff that somebody wrote. Again, I go back to the Amazing Grace guy. Like he had a terrible life and
Yeah.
made some pretty terrible choices. And to have and that amazing worship song comes out of that space.
Yeah.
And so not out of a studio per se. Again, super cynical on that part too, but I will always look and listen and sing worship music through that lens.
Yeah. I was going to go with a really cynical comment next.
Oh, say it and then edit it out.
Okay, so this is my really cynical comment that I'm not going to edit out. There's it came up on my music show recently. We were talking about a 5 Iron Frenzy, of course, because they get mentioned every episode.
It all circles back to them.
It all is about them. There was I got a bootleg copy of their last performance at Cornerstone, and before they played their final song, Reese makes the comment, and I was reminded of this while we were recording, so now it's been like burrowed into my head recently. He's like, we wanted a song, he's like, we wanted a song that was inspired, and we really think that God gave us one. And I hear that all the time. Like people are like, oh, God inspired me, and this is a song inspired by God, and then they play the song, and you're like, it's not very good, guys. What are we doing here? And that's kind of how I feel about so much of the modern worship. Like every 3 months, it's on cue. Just when the streaming numbers start to dip a little, they're inspired by God to come up with a new single. It's amazing. The Lord moves in such mysterious ways in all of these huge worship institutions. It's amazing. Stream every 3 months. The Lord just provides a new single. It's amazing. Anyway, super cynical. That's how we should end our music
That's
conversation.
as cynical as we've gotten on this podcast.
That it is. That is as cynical as we've gotten. I apologize
It's not all bad.
for my cynicism.
It's okay. No one's listening. Still, I get it. Sometimes it's easy to poo-poo that stuff, even though it is significant for a lot of people, right? I mean, we did talk about in Tim's episode, and you were pretty clear about it. Like that stuff does need to be accessible to people for them to partake and sing in it, and be part of the service. So there's reasons for it, and it obviously edifies a lot of people's lives. That all being said, I think both you and I have a little bit of a keen ear to what's kind of simple, both musically and theologically, and we tend to stay away from it. So it just doesn't do it for us.
This is what you get when you don't want to prepare. You just get Caleb off the cuff, just shooting.
So we gotta stop.
Boom, boom, boom. I'll take you all down.
All right, let's end it on a positive note, though. Come on, you can think of one positive thing.
The way to end on the positive note is that I had totally missed that Tim's group had produced 2 more hymns albums. I had I helped kickstart the first one, and then I totally missed the second 2. And so this was great to talk with him and kind of remember that there's out there. And so I've been listening a lot to the second 2 Hope Hymns albums. I know he doesn't necessarily get any money from them anymore, but it was kind of fun to go back and discover those 2 more hymns albums that I could add to my collection. And so there you go. There's the positive. It's
there's a silver lining.
Yeah, a little more, a couple more hymns in my collection of stuff I can go back to. And as I've been going through a fun season of extreme anxiety, I've been playing a lot of hymns recently. So that has been a joy to be able to connect with. So I think we plugged those on the show, the Hope hymns, but they're all on streaming, so you can definitely go check them out. You just do Hope hymns, and it'll be there. There's the first one's it's a red tree. There's a red cover with a white tree on it, and you'll know you found the right place.
Yep. They're a good time for sure. They're for sure. Well, the whole series has been, like you said, quite fun. Talking with Bill, connecting with him, of course. Talking about Tim about a topic that's important to us and we still engage with, and then Eric and Josh were just great interviews.
Yep.
So we really thank all 4 of you guys for recording, and hopefully you enjoyed your episodes in this series as well. And we really appreciate you all for listening. We'll be back with more regular interviews and a normal schedule next week. Hope you enjoy.
Will we? All right, I better get editing.
All right. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, we do want to thank Eric and Josh for sitting down and talking with us about not just their experience last week, but really talking about the current Christian music scene and kind of some of the things going on. It was great to have them on the show. They're great resources for all things music related, but especially Christian music. So great to have their insights. Great to hear some of their recommendations. Thanks so much, guys, for taking time out of your schedule to join us. Let us know what you thought about this episode or any of our other shows. You can find the show on Twitter at the handle @SurviveYG. You can also email the show at ISurvivedYouthGroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, let us know. You didn't necessarily have to attend our youth group, but if you have your own youth group experience from the 90s or the 2000s that you would like to share and talk about, we'd love to connect. We'd love to hear your story and how that youth group experience has impacted your life. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, leave a rating or review. If you enjoy this show, especially the shows about music, I do run another podcast. It's called the Album Anniversary Podcast. And over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. We've had a couple different formats on the show, but it's a chance to sit down and talk about and celebrate one of those albums that I've documented on my calendar. Once again, it's the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pyre Roberts. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon. Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your co-host Caleb, and today we're going to pick up where we left off with Eric and Josh talking about Christian music in the 90s and kind of today. That's actually what we're going to transition to and kind of talk more about kind of what that scene looks like today. Shoot. 3, 2, 1. Greetings. Welcome. 3, 2, 1. Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your co-host Caleb, and I'm just going to do a quick, brief intro for the show today. 3, 2, 1. Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, or I'm your co-host. Dang it. Oh my gosh. 3, 2, 1. Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, for the second time, we want to thank Eric and Josh for joining our show to talk about this topic of Christian music and kind of what it looks like today. It was great to have their insights and just two great resources if you want to know more about music in general, but specifically Christian music. Again, check out their stuff, Josh Baylog and Eric McClanahan, the I Never Glow show. Nope, that's not right. It's the Dang it, I was doing so good. 3, 2, 1.